In this video, we are going to start working with CSS to do one of the most basic but sometimes tricky aspects of building a website, and this is positioning. Positioning is about placing the HTML elements of our website where we want them to be. Positioning is done with CSS, so let's start with a little introduction to CSS. We know that HTML gives structure to our websites, right? Now we are going to use CSS to add style. Style is not only about making things look nice. It is about presentation, about the whole appearance of our HTML. Let's see an example to illustrate how to use CSS. Let's say we have this HTML code here. This is going to display the text in the default style for an H1 tag. What if we want to make it green and larger, for example? We will use CSS for that. This is the code. This piece of code is what we call a CSS rule. And what we are doing here is creating the styles, in that case a font size and a color, and apply them to a HTML element, an H1 in that case. And this is going to be the result. Let's now see the syntax of a CSS rule. We have the selector that identifies the HTML element to which the style rule is applied. And then we have a set of properties and value pairs that we call declarations that create the style. A property, for example, is color and a value is green. This is the color green associated with the property color applied to the selector H1. That is what we have done in our example. The semicolon at the end of each one of the declarations is mandatory except for the last property. So we have the HTML elements we want to style and the CSS rules to create the styles we want to apply to those HTML elements. The next question is, where do we place those styles? Styles can be located in three different places: inline styles, internal styles, and external styles. Inline styles are added as attributes of the HTML elements they are applied to. We use the style attribute and then within quotes we place the styles we want to apply to that element. Inline styles is something we want to avoid because as we are adding the style individually for each one of the HTML elements, the task of adding styles becomes very repetitive and the code that it's generated is very hard to maintain. So let's try to avoid this way of adding styles to our HTML. Another option is using internal styles. In that case, the rules are placed in the head of the document using the style tags. This is better than inline styles, but not the best option because each file will require its own style tags with its own styles rules, and this again is going to be repetitive and hard to maintain. The last option is to use an external style. In that case, the styles are created in an external CSS file, and then we have to add the reference to that file in the HTML document. We do so using the link tag. This is the syntax. In the href attribute of that tag, we place the path to the file, to the CSS file. The name of that file can be any name we want. Using an external style file is the recommended way of adding styles, so let's try to avoid the inline and internal styles. Now let's talk about one key element in CSS, the selector. We have seen that the selector is what we use to specify the HTML element to which we want to apply the style we are defining, right? Let's see how can we do that. In the examples we have seen, we have been using the HTML tag as the selector. But there are other ways to identify the HTML element we want to style. There are other types of selectors besides the HTML tag, and this is what we are going to see now. There are 5 types of selectors: basic selectors, contextual selectors, pseudo classes, pseudo elements, and attribute selectors. Let's start with the most basic ones, the basic selectors. The basic selectors are the element selector, the ID selector, and the class selector. The element selector is the HTML tag of the element we want to style. Here we are using the P tag as the selector. That means that we are going to apply the style we are defining to all the P elements in our website. The ID selector selects the HTML element that has a specific ID. To define that ID in the CSS, we use the hashtag and the name of the ID. We can use any name we want here. Then we have to apply that ID to the HTML element we want to style. To do so, we use the ID attribute with the name of the ID selector we defined in the CSS, in that case, outer box. The class selector selects all the elements that have a specific class. To define the class selector in the CSS, we do it in a very similar way as we do for the ID selector, but using a dot instead of the hashtag. Then we assign the class to the HTML element using the class attribute instead of the ID attribute. What will happen here? Because we have a style rule defined for all the P elements, and now we are applying also the style defined for the mark class. What do you think is going to happen? Right, both styles are going to be applied to the P element. So this P element is going to be rendered red and with a font size of 20 pixels. If the property defined by the class selector was the same defined by the P selector, the color in that case, what will happen is that the color defined by the class will override the color defined by the P. This happens because the style defined by a class selector is more specific than the style defined by a element selector. Don't worry too much about that. This is something we are going to see later. I just want you to know that this happens. You might be asking what's the point of having classes and IDs. Well, IDs are meant to be unique, meaning only one element with a specific ID per page, while classes are meant to be applied to many elements, to as many elements as we want to have a specific style defined by a class. Make sense? If we want to apply the same style to a set of elements, we can group them together. We do it by separating them with commas. And this is all for basic selectors. Let's now see the contextual ones. The contextual selectors allows us to select elements based on their relationship with other elements, siblings, children, parents. Sentence selector selects all the elements that are child of another. To use it, we place the name of the parent selector space the name of the child selector. Similar to the descendant selector, we have the child selector. This one selects only the direct children. This is the difference. And to use it, we place the name of the parent selector, this greater than sign, and then the name of the child selector. Let's see an example of how to use them. Here we have a piece of HTML code representing a list. The UL element is the one we use to create the list. The LI element is the one for each one of the elements of that list, of the items inside the list. And then we have the OL element that creates an ordered list. This is a list with the items preceded by a number. And this is how this HTML code is rendered. If we have this CSS rule, which elements are going to be green? Right, all the LI elements, because we are using here a descendant selector, and this is going to select all the descendants, not only the direct children. You can see here that we are using a combination of selectors. We are using UL, which is a element selector, hashtag main nav, which is a ID selector. This means that we are going to select the elements that are an UL element and that have the ID main nav. Let's mark here the elements that are going to be green. All the LI elements that are a descendant of the element UL with ID main nav. What about this other CSS rule? Here we are selecting the direct children of the UL element with ID main nav. So which elements are going to be blue? This one, not this one and this other one, and the last one. This will be the fav text and the 3 and 4 elements. Let me draw the DOM tree here so you can see the hierarchy of the elements better. We have the parent UL element, the 3 direct children that are the LI elements, one OL list that is a child of the second LI element, and the 2 LI elements of the OL list. The green elements are all the LI elements that are descendant of the UL element, meaning all the LI elements in our tree. And the blue elements are only the LI elements that are direct children of UL. Those 3 here. Then we have the sibling selectors, and there are 2 types. The adjacent sibling selector that selects the selectors that are adjacent, meaning one next to the other, and the general sibling selector. This one selects all the elements that are at the same level, meaning all the elements that have the same parent. To indicate an adjacent sibling selector, we use the plus sign, one element plus the other element. Then for the general sibling selector, we use the tilde element. Let's see a couple of examples to illustrate the use of the sibling elements. Here we have a div element with a set of elements inside, all of them at the same level, all direct children of the div element. And now we have the selector h2 plus p. What element do you think is going to be selected? Right, the p element next to the h2 element, which is this p here. In this other selector, we have more than two elements. We are chaining elements. What we are doing here is indicating the path to the element we want to select, which is the last one of the chain, meaning the p element that is next to the p element that is next to the h2 element. This one here. And our last example. In this case, we'll have h2 tilde p. This will select all the p elements that are siblings of h2, all the p elements that are at the same level of h2, meaning all the p elements inside the div in that case. And we are done with the contextual selectors. The next type of selectors we are going to see are the pseudo-classes. Pseudo-classes are defined by a colon, and they select the elements based in their state or in their position. There are three types: the link-related ones, input-related, and the position-based. The link-related pseudo-classes are active, hover, and visited. Active is for the link that is being visited. Hover is when we roll the mouse over the link. And visited is for links we have already visited. This is a link. We use the A tag to create links. And this link is going to be displayed with the default style for links. If I want to change the color of the link when I hover over it, I will use the A tag with the hover pseudo class. This is the code. You can see here that for the color, I'm not using the name of the color, but a code. This is hexadecimal code, and is another way of telling the name of the color we want to use. We will see more about that later. If we want to change the hover color only for the links with a specific class, we can add the class to the selector. In that case, for example, we are adding the custom class to the A element and then the pseudo class hover. Here we could use only the class, that custom, and then the pseudo class hover. Adding the element to the selector makes it more specific. In that case, we want to apply that rule only to the elements that are links and have the custom class. Both things are required. Link-related pseudo-classes are mostly used with links, but sometimes, or some of them, can be used with other elements that accept mouse interactions, such as buttons or images. The next type of pseudo-classes we are going to see are the input-related pseudo-classes, and some of them are focus, enable, valid, invalid, disabled, and checked. Those selectors are mostly used with forms, so we are going to talk in more detail about them when we talk about forms. But now I want to show you how to use them. This is the HTML code to create a text box, like the one you use in forms for enter, for example, your name. Text boxes and other type of boxes we use in forms are called input, so we use the input tag in order to create the input element. The input-related pseudo-classes allows us to modify the style of those input boxes depending on their state. So, for example, we can use the focus pseudo class to modify the style of the text box when we select it to start typing. In that case, the border of the box when it has the focus, it's going to be blue. The next type of selectors we are going to see are the position-based selectors, and they are first child, last child, nth child, first of type, and last of type. Those are just the most common selectors. You can go to W3 Schools and see there the whole list of the selectors that CSS provides. To understand those selectors, let me show you an example. Here we have the HTML code to create a list. That should sound familiar because we have already seen that. And this is what this code is going to show in the browser. The first child selector selects the element that is the first child of its parent. In that case, it's going to select any li element that is the first child of its parent, whatever that parent is. So the color red is going to be applied to this li element here, which is the first child of this parent, ul, and to this other li element that is the first child of this other parent, this other ul. The last child selector works exactly the same, but for the last child of the parent. So the blue elements are going to be this one here and that other one. The nth child selector also works in a similar way, but it selects the element that is the n child of its parent, where n can be any number. In that case, we are selecting the second li element of each parent. So the elements with a font size of 20 pixels are going to be this one and this other one. If we want to select all the elements that are in an even position inside the parent, we can use nth element with even as a parameter. And same thing if we want to select the ones that are in the odd positions. Let me show you another example to illustrate the use of first of type. The first of type selector selects the first elements of the indicated type within any parent. It doesn't need to be the first child, just the first element with the indicated type. So in this example here, the elements to which we are going to apply the color red will be this paragraph here and this other one here. Make sense? And we are done with the pseudo classes. Let's now see the pseudo elements. The most commonly used pseudo elements are after and before. And you can see we use 2 colons to indicate those pseudo elements. You can also use just 1 colon, but this is the old way of doing it, so it's recommended to use the 2 colons. Those elements are used to insert content before or after the element. Let me show you an example. Here we have a p element that will show the text hello in the browser. Now I can use this CSS rule here to add the text imp before the hello text. We use the content property to indicate the text we want to add, which should be placed within quotes. Besides the content property, we can add here any other property we need to give a style to the text we are adding. We can add color, font size, whatever we need. Those selectors allows us to add content on the fly after the HTML has been created. And this is something that can be very useful sometimes. We are done with the pseudo elements. Let's now see the last group of selectors, the attribute selectors. Those selectors select HTML elements that have a specific attribute or an attribute with a specific value. Let's see some examples. Square brackets and the name of the attribute we want to select. This will select all the elements with the attribute we specify here, for example, href. This one selects an element with a specified attribute and value. This selects the elements with the attribute value containing a whole word equal to the specified value in the selector. That one, the attribute that begins with that specified value, that one for the attribute that ends with the specified value, and that one selects the elements with the attribute value containing the superstring specified here. The value of the attribute in the HTML element should contain this superstring. This means that part of the word should match this superstring. It doesn't need to be the whole word as happens with the attribute with the tilde. So we have 3 links here, and I want to select the ones that are pointing to a PDF document so that I can style them with a different color, for example. How can I do that? Right, we will use the $attribute selector. This selector will select the element with an attribute that has a value ending with the specified value here in the selector. In the selector, we set the name of the attribute to href and the value to .pdf. Using the A tag in the selector here is not mandatory. Remember that what this does is make the selector more specific. And this is it for the selectors. We have seen the most commonly used ones, but if you want to see a comprehensive list of all the selectors that CSS offers, you can go to W3 Schools, which is a very, very, very good resource, as I have already said. This is the URL. This video is getting way too long, so what I'm going to do is leave it here and continue in another video where I'm going to show you a couple more things I want you to know before we get into positioning and positioning itself. So thanks for watching and see you in the next video.